Our reading today takes us back to Matthew, and we have to situate ourselves back in the story of Joseph and the dreams of Joseph, as well as the promise that John the Baptist received and the assurance to John the Baptist that Jesus really was the Messiah. So today's scripture, there's three parts to it. First part is after the Magi have left. Joseph and Mary take Jesus to Egypt as a refugee. They're having to flee because they know Herod wants to kill Jesus. The second part is the horrible story of the killing of all of those babies and toddlers, the boys, in Bethlehem after Mary and Joseph get away with Jesus. And the third part is Joseph and Mary and Jesus returning back, but not staying in Judea, but going on to Galilee and living in Nazareth. So let's unpack that a little bit. First of all, the story that we have in Matthew of Jesus' birth in his early years is very, very different from what we have in the Gospel of Luke. In fact, I think one of the sad things is that it's the Sunday after Christmas when everybody is just exhausted, that we actually have the two stories that talk about Jesus as a child. In Luke, we talk about Jesus at 13 going into the temple and his parents thinking that he was with them in the caravan and them rushing back to get him. And here in Matthew, we have the story of Jesus as a 2-year-old. He'd been visited by the Magi and then fled, became a refugee. A lot of people don't remember or don't realize this is where the story comes from. This year, I've noticed a lot of social media posts where people are saying, like, where is this refugee business? And a lot of us are wondering how you could miss that. But honestly, if you're not paying attention to the whole story in Matthew, which very few people do, we prefer Luke, then you miss this as part of the birth narrative of Jesus. He is never safe in Matthew. In Luke, he's safe, but not in Matthew. Matthew, he has to go as a refugee into Egypt, which is not always a safe place for the Hebrew people, although there was a community there at one point. That community was destroyed by the Ptolemies in Egypt because they did not want to have a Hebrew community there, and they were not supported by Jerusalem because Jerusalem didn't want to have a Hebrew community there. So Joseph and Mary and Jesus were outcasts in every sense of the word. The only thing they probably survived on, much like the refugees today, is whatever skills they had, because they had nothing physical with them. They just got up in the middle of the night and ran, like so many parents today do with children. When we look at the refugee situation, we must remember that Jesus was a refugee himself. When we talk about doing unto the least of these, we are talking about how people today need to tend to refugees, much like Jesus was tended to back in the day. They were in a point where they could return. A lot of refugees today are never going to get to that point. So we have the story of Jesus as a refugee. We don't have any details of that, just that he went to Egypt. In the meantime, back in Bethlehem, Herod's rage is so complete, so absolutely horrific, that he orders the slaughter of all boys 2 and under. I can't imagine the horror that would have been lived in that time. And Matthew does something really interesting with the story. He doesn't just leave it there as this horrific event. Like most things in Matthew, he roots it in the Hebrew scripture. And the scripture he uses is actually Jeremiah 31:15, which is interesting because it's known as the book of consolation within the prophecy of Jeremiah that talks about hope and renewed living and returning to the land and people living in peace and prosperity. And this one little bit talks about the land of Ramah and Rachel crying for her children. Now, Ramah was a territory that was about 8 kilometers north of Jerusalem, and it was right on the border. It could be considered either Judah or Israel, depending on how you looked at it. So when the passage had to do with the exile of the Judeans into Babylon, but it could also reference the exile of the Israelites into Assyria. So either way works. And the addition to that is that Rachel had 2 sons. She had Joseph and Benjamin. Well, Benjamin's tribe was south with the Judeans, whereas Joseph's tribe was actually came through his two sons, I believe Ephraim and Manasseh. And those tribes were part of the 10 tribes that were in north in Israel that were lost into Assyria. So, no matter which way you look at it, you see the entirety of the Hebrew people being lost. And the passage says they're gone as if they were no more. Whereas in Matthew, dead is dead. Those babies were dead. In the reference to Jeremiah, they all came back, or at least a good chunk of them came back to start their life again as renewed people. So even though this horrific thing happened that Matthew tells us about, it is surrounded by the promise of hope and the promise of renewal and the promise that life will go on. Hard lesson to hear if you are directly affected by the death of a child, but as a society, absolutely paramount that something horrific doesn't stop us, that we realize that there's something bigger at stake, someone, God is bigger working in our worlds. And then the third part is Joseph and Mary and Jesus coming back when Jesus is 4-ish, 5-ish, and then not staying in Judea, in Bethlehem or Jerusalem, but going up into Nazareth. Why Nazareth? We're not really sure. Matthew quotes a scripture that no one can actually find the reference to. It's one of the few times, I think maybe the only time, where Matthew quotes something that has not survived antiquity. No one has processed it or found it in any ancient scripts at all. But there's something about Nazareth. And one of the really interesting things about the word that is the base of Nazareth is it also means the shoot of a tree, just like Jesse and David was the shoot of the tree of Jesse. So there might be some connection there, that maybe going into Galilee was not so much about the place, but about the spiritual connection to the house of David. Because remember, this is Matthew. Everything is based in the Hebrew scriptures. So we have stories today of Exodus, much like the Exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt. We have Joseph having dreams, much like the Joseph in Genesis had dreams. We had Egypt being the safe place and then having to come out of it, just like Joseph thought it was the safe place for his family. We have the deaths of innocents, much like the Babylonian exile and the Assyrian exile. All of this reminding the hearers of Matthew that everything that happens to Jesus is rooted in the Hebrew promise. Jesus is not a free agent. Didn't just spring up like any other philosopher, because Jesus was not the only game in town. There were a lot of people who spoke about renewal and peace and against the Romans and all of that stuff. But Jesus, Matthew wants us to make sure that we know Jesus is rooted in the Hebrew tradition, in the promise God has given us, in the hope that God has given us. And as we move now out of the birth narrative of Jesus into his ministry over the next number of weeks, we start to see that hope materialize, that there is promise here, that we are on a journey, but we're not the start of it. We are a continuation on the generations upon generations of people who've walked before in the Hebrew tradition, believing in and worshiping God. That's where we are on our journey this week.